In this section of the course, we're going to turn our attention towards selecting objects, aligning and grouping, because these are three fundamental skills that you need to use in PowerPoint in order to make sure that your presentations look professional. Because in my experience, nothing looks more unprofessional than a slide deck where objects are not completely aligned on the page. Even if an object is very slightly off, it really brings down the whole presentation. So we want to make sure that we are confident when it comes to making selections, moving objects around, aligning them and grouping them. So we're going to start out in this lesson by taking a look at some of the fundamentals when it comes to selecting objects. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean exactly what I say, selecting different things on our page. So currently I have the title selected. If I click underneath, I have the subtitle selected. If I click at the top, I have the explore text selected, so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to selecting objects, there are a few fundamental rules that you should know. So let's insert a new blank slide and have a little practice. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add some shapes onto this page, and we'll use some circles as our example. So let's add one, and I'm just going to duplicate this a few times by pressing Control D. And let's just grab these and place them randomly on this slide. Now, how do I select these objects? Well, I can simply click on the first one. I could hold down my Shift key, click on the second one, the third one, and the fourth one in order to select them all. Once I have them all selected, I can then make global changes to all of them at the same time. So if I want to change them to a different color, I can. And if I want to change the shape outline to something different, I can. And then when I click on the background, I deselect all of those objects. Now, another way that I can select objects is to simply select the first one. I can hold down my Control key as opposed to Shift in order to make my selections nice and easy. A third way I can select objects is to basically just draw a big rectangle around everything that I want to select. So if I just click and drag and then let go, it's going to select all of those objects. Click away to deselect. Now, that final technique I just showed you is particularly useful if you have a lot of objects on your page that overlap. So sometimes if we have sort of objects which are on top of each other like this, and we want to maybe select the third one, sometimes it's not quite so easy to do that if they're all crowded together. So that is where this technique comes in really handy, because it allows us just to quickly select everything contained within that rectangle. So just bear that in mind when you're selecting your objects. Now, there is a fourth way that we can select objects on our page, and that is by using the selection pane. And the selection pane has many different uses. Now, in order to pull up the selection pane, you need to make sure you have at least one object selected on your slide, because that's then going to give us access to the shape format contextual ribbon, which is where you're going to find the selection pane. So over in the Arrange group, let's click Selection Pane. And notice that we have over on the right hand side this new pane open up. And what this pane will do is it will list out all of the objects that you have within your slide. And you can see here we've got oval 1, oval 2, oval 3 and oval 4. So by default, PowerPoint will give your objects generic names. But this is another way that we can select different things in our slides. And I have to say that this selection pane becomes very useful when we have lots of objects on our slide. I can simply click on oval 3 and it's going to select it. Click on oval 4, it's going to select it, so on and so forth. And if I want to select all of my objects, I can hold down Control and just select them all in that selection pane. Another way that this can be really useful is, again, if we have objects that are all overlapping, like this, maybe I decide that I want to change the color of the third circle back here, and I can only see a very small slither of that third circle. So making that selection is quite difficult. Now what I could do here is use my selection pane to select it, or alternatively I could hide all of the circles that are on top of the one that I want to format. Notice in the selection pane you have this little eye icon next to each of the objects. And currently all of the eyes are open, which means I'm showing everything. But if I say click on circle 1, let's click on the eye, that's going to hide it. And notice that it's now disappeared from the slide. It hasn't been deleted, it's just temporarily hidden. We can click again to bring it back. So what I could do here is maybe hide all of the circles that I don't need, which just exposes this circle, and that makes it a lot easier for me to go in and change the color of that circle. Once I'm done, I can unhide everything, and I haven't had to move objects around in order to apply formatting to something that's either partially or almost completely covered by other objects. So the selection pane can be super useful. I'm going to show you some other techniques using this selection pane when we talk about aligning and managing objects on our slide. In the last lesson, we saw how we can use various different techniques to select objects on a slide. And the last technique that we looked at was using the selection pane. So I kind of want to carry on that vein and show you how you can also use the selection pane to arrange and manage all of the different objects that you have on your slide. Now, as we saw previously in the selection pane, currently I have 4 circles or 4 ovals in this case, and they've just got the generic names of oval 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, this isn't particularly meaningful. And if you have many objects on your slide and they all have generic names, it can be quite difficult to know exactly what you need to select. If I have 10 text boxes, and in the selection pane they're just called text box 1, text box 2, text box 3, I don't really know which text box I need to select from the list. So one of the things I would recommend that you get into the habit of doing is that you come into this selection pane and you rename all of the objects to make them easier to identify. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to make these objects a little bit different. Let's just spread them out a bit more again. And I'm just going to change the color of all of these. So let's go for, I'm just going to use a shape style for this. Let's change this one to green, this one to blue, this one to yellow, and this one to gray. So now what I would probably do in the selection pane is give these meaningful names. So the first one here, oval 1, you can see it's selected. If you simply click, it's going to allow you to rename that object. So I'm going to change this to green circle, and you can hit enter to set that. And I would do exactly the same for all of these. So let's click, let's change this to blue circle and hit enter. And I'm going to do the same for the other 2. So now this makes it a lot easier for me to identify exactly which object I'm selecting. Now we saw in the previous lesson how we can click this little show hide eyeball icon in order to hide or display different objects on the slide. And as I mentioned, this can be particularly useful if you have lots of overlapping objects and you're trying to get to one that's kind of further down the stack in order to edit it. But something else we can use this selection pane for is to rearrange the order of objects as well. And again, I'm going to overlap these objects just to make this super easy for you to see. So let's just put these circles on top of each other. Now the order that these circles have overlapped is called the Z order. And the way to kind of think about this is whenever you add an object into PowerPoint, it essentially appears on its own layer. And these layers are all on top of each other. And you can change the stacking order or the layer order simply by moving items around in the selection pane. We can also do this by using the send backward or send to back options on the toolbar. So let's look at that first of all. If I select this grey circle, which currently is at the front, and you can see that in the selection pane, it's at the top of the list, which means it's the first object that's at the front. If I wanted to send this all the way to the back, so effectively behind all of the other circles, there's a couple of different techniques I could use. Let's jump up to Shape Format, And again, we have our bring forward and send backward buttons. Now, if I click the drop down next to send backward, I have two choices. I can send backward or I can send to the back. Now, if I was to send it backward, it's just going to move back one position. So it's just moved behind the next circle, which in this case was the yellow circle. If I want to send this grey circle all the way to the back, that is when I would choose send to back. And now you can see in the selection pane, the grey circle is at the bottom of the list because it's the object that's furthest towards the back. So we can manipulate the Z order of objects in this way. If I want to bring that back to the front, again, I can use to bring it forward one position, or I can just bring it all the way back to the front, which will move it to the top of the list in the selection pane. Now, similarly, instead of using bring forward and send backward, I can rearrange the order using the selection pane. So I could simply grab grey circle and drag it down to the bottom of the list to change that Z order. I could then grab the green circle and pull that to the top, which is going to put it in front. I could grab the yellow circle and place that behind the blue circle. So this is a really nice way of just quickly organizing all of the objects on your slide. You also have some up and down arrows just here in the selection pane, which will just allow you to do exactly the same thing, but with clickable arrows instead. So your takeaways from this lesson are to name all of the objects that you have on your slide and be mindful of the different techniques you can use in order to change that Z order. Now, if we go back to our title slide for a moment and take a look at the selection pane here, we haven't renamed anything, and this is what I mean. This is why it can get quite confusing if you don't rename your objects. You can see we have text box 28. Like, what does that relate to? It could be anything. I've got a few different text boxes on this slide. When I click on it, I can see that, okay, that is the subtitle. If I click on 27, that's the title. So I'm probably going to want to go through and rename all of these items. So I'm going to do that now, and I'll join you back here once I've done that. So now I've renamed all of those items with meaningful text, so it makes it a lot easier for me to see exactly what I'm selecting. Now, if you remember in one of the previous lessons when we were trying to change the title text, the Explore text box was in front of this title text, which made it really difficult for me to select this text. And all we did to combat that was to select the Explore text box and we sent it backward so that it was behind the title and the subtitle. So this is where you can use that same technique in the selection pane. If I want to bring the Explore text box to the front again, I could simply drag and drop it. So now when I click somewhere in here, it's going to be that Explore text box that I select. If I want to make changes to this title text, I can grab the Explore text box and just drag it so it's underneath subtitle and title. And that makes it a lot easier for me to select these objects. Now, another thing I could do if I did have this Explore text box as the first object at the front, and I wanted to get to what was underneath in order to be able to edit it, I could simply turn off my eyeball icon. So if I click to hide, it's going to hide it, and I can now get to that text behind, make my changes, and then show that text again. So lots of different ways that this selection pane is extremely useful. It's now time to talk about a really important part of PowerPoint, and that is how to align objects on your page. And this is something that sounds very simple and very fundamental, but you wouldn't believe how many people don't really know how to do this correctly, and their presentations suffer for it. As I've mentioned, anything that's just even slightly not aligned correctly can really ruin what is otherwise a great presentation. And there are lots of different techniques that you can use for aligning things on your page, so let's take a look at a few of them. Now for this, we're going to go back onto slide 2 where we have our circles. And I'm just going to drag these and place them randomly on the slide. So we'll do something like that. Now, maybe my objective here is to align all of these circles dead in the center of this slide. And I also want to make sure that we have equal space in between each of these circles. So how can we do this? Well, everything in PowerPoint always starts with a selection. And we've seen the different ways that we can select multiple objects on our slide. So which one you use, I don't mind. I'm going to use my favorite technique, which is simply to draw a big box around all of them to select them. Now, you have a lot of different alignment tools in PowerPoint, and you'll find them in a couple of different places. You'll find alignment tools on the home ribbon underneath this arrange group just here. If you go down to the bottom, notice you have an align option, and this is where you'll find your alignment tools. Alternatively, you can find them on the shape format ribbon. In the arrange group, we have an align drop down just here, and we have those same tools. So you can see here we have align left, align center, align right, top, middle, bottom, and then we have some distribute options as well. And we're going to use a few of these to achieve the effect that we're looking for with these circles. Now, the first thing I want to do here is I want to align them horizontally on this slide. So looking at the options that I have, I think I need to go for this one here, aligning objects to the middle. So let's select it, and that's exactly what I want. Now, I'm not done here because notice the problem that I have. I have inconsistent white space in between each of these objects. And this is where your distribute options come in. What I'm going to do is go back up to align, and I want to say distribute horizontally. And that will just ensure that we have equal space in between each of the selected objects. So my objects are now distributed equally, and they're aligned to the middle. But they're still not dead in the center of the slide. I need to do some vertical alignment as well. Now, if I go back up to align, I want to choose this option here, align to the center. Now, if I do that, take a look at what happens. It treats them all as individual objects and just aligns all of them to the center. So now they're kind of overlapping, which isn't really what I want. So let's do Control Z. Now, in order to do this and align them as a group, we need to group the objects together. And you'll notice that on that shape format ribbon, we also have a group option as well. So you can choose to use this command just here. The way that I tend to do this is the quicker way, using the keyboard shortcut. So to group objects together, you can press Control G. So now these are no longer individual circles, they're grouped together as one object. So now when I go to shape format and go to align and align center, it's going to align it as a group, as one object, as opposed to individual shapes. So now these are dead in the center of the slide. And if I just want to double check, I can go back to align and align middle just to move those down as a group. Once I've got these in the correct position, I can ungroup them again so I can work on those objects individually. And once again, you could use the group and ungroup command from the ribbon, or alternatively, you can use the keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-G to ungroup. Now, other things that I would encourage you to turn on when you're working in PowerPoint to help you when it comes to aligning are things like smart guides, grid lines, and guides. So to turn these on, if you right-click your mouse anywhere on the background of your slide, you'll notice that you have a few options in here. Now, one thing I would check is that you have your ruler turned on so that you can see both your horizontal and your vertical ruler. Now, if you hover your mouse over grids and guides, we have a little pop-out menu to the side. And again, I would always recommend that you turn on your smart guides. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what are smart guides and how can they be useful? Well, let me show you an example. We have our circles in the background all nicely aligned. I'm going to ruin that now by moving one of them. But notice as I move, can you see I get these guidelines come up? And these are there to really help me align objects on the page. So currently you can see where I have this green circle, it's showing me the distance between the circle and the center of the slide, and it's also showing me the distance between the other objects on the page. So if I start to move this around, you can see that when I move it towards the center, I get that center line. So that tells me that this green circle is dead in the center vertically. If I start to move it down, I should eventually get to a point where I see the horizontal guide, like so, and that's showing me that this circle is now dead in the center of that slide. So these smart guides will come up in relation to the actual slide, but also in relation to other objects that you have on the page. For example, if I want to try and line this green circle up with the blue circle, as soon as I've got that correct, I'm seeing those two lines come up. These are your smart guides in action, and they can be so useful when you're trying to align lots of different things on your page. So make sure that you do have those turned on in that right-click menu. You can also right-click and turn on simple guides. So if I turn these on, it's basically going to show me a horizontal and a vertical guide, which again can be really useful if you're trying to maybe add images to exactly half of the slide or line up things like text. And we're going to be using these horizontal guides quite a lot throughout the balance of this course. Let's right-click and let's just turn off those guides. Also in this right-click menu, we have grid lines as well. So if you want to turn these on, it's going to just show you this grid structure. And again, this can be quite useful when you're aligning particularly smaller objects on your slide, if you want to get it exactly correct. So if I drag this green circle up, I could use my arrow keys just to nudge it along and exactly line it up with the grid that we have just here. Now I'm going to move that down a bit. And I kind of have that aligned. I could grab the blue circle and I could say that I kind of want one square of the grid in between each of my objects, which in itself is going to align these quite nicely. So lots of different options available when it comes to aligning objects. Now, one final thing to mention here, if I grab a couple of these circles and I'm just going to put this blue circle so it's slightly off center. Now, if I want to align both of these together, the order that you select these objects really matters. So if I select the green circle, hold down Shift and select the blue circle, jump up to Arrange and go into Align, if I choose Align Left, because the green circle was selected first, PowerPoint is going to take that as the object that you want to align the other objects to. So if I choose Align Left, it's going to move the blue circle to the left and put it in line with the green circle. It's not going to move the green circle and align it with the blue. So if I say Align Left, that blue circle is going to move. So just be aware of that. If I drag the yellow circle just here, so what I could do here is select the green circle and then the yellow circle, go to my alignment tools and choose Align Top. So just be aware that the order that you select is really important. Now, the final thing I want to mention here is the accessibility of these alignment tools. You're going to find that these are tools that you use on every single slide that you create because you always want to make sure your objects are aligned. So my recommendation is to add all of your alignment tools to your quick access toolbar. And I actually did this when we were looking at customizing the QAT earlier on in this course. I always like to have my alignment tools available just here so I don't have to hunt through the ribbons looking for them. So that is one last little efficiency tip when it comes to aligning things on your slide. In this exercise, we're going to practice some of the skills we've learned in relation to selecting, aligning, and grouping objects. So the first thing I'd like you to do is insert a brand new blank slide into the Jupyter Space presentation. I'd then like you to insert 4 rounded rectangle shapes and place them randomly on the slide. And I'd like you to make sure that each shape is filled with a different colour. I'd then like you to align the shapes so that they are in the centre of the slide and ensure that there is an equal distance between each of the shapes. I'd then like you to open up the selection pane and rename all of the objects to something more meaningful to make them easier to identify. And I'll leave it up to you to decide what you want to call these shapes. That is it, pretty straightforward. See how you get on with that, and if you'd like to see my answer, then please keep watching. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to insert a new blank slide. So let's go to new slide, let's add a blank, And now we need to add 4 rounded rectangle shapes. So this is the tool we need, rectangle rounded corners. And I don't really mind if these are more oblong style shapes or if you hold down Shift and make them square rounded rectangles, as long as we have 4 of them on the page. So what I'm going to do here is just duplicate this shape 3 more times. 1, 2, 3. And we're going to spread these randomly around the page. I then asked you to fill each one with a different colour. So let's just use our shape styles here. We'll make this one orange, this one yellow, and this one green. Next, I asked you to align all of these shapes in the centre of the slide and make sure there's equal distance between each of the shapes. So we're going to select all of our shapes. Now remember, there are a few different ways you can do this. You can hold down Shift to select them all, or you can drag a big box around all of the shapes. We're then going to go up to the Arrange drop down and into Align, and we're going to say Align to Middle. Back to Arrange because we want to make sure that we distribute them horizontally. Now we're going to group the shapes, Control G, back up to Arrange and Align, and we're going to say Align Center and also Align Middle again. And that's going to put our shapes directly in the middle of the slide. Control Shift G to ungroup them. The next thing I asked you to do was to open up the selection pane. So I'm going to go to Arrange and Selection pane and rename all of the objects to make them more meaningful. So this one here, I'm just going to call blue rectangle. This one is going to be orange rectangle. And just to make this a bit quicker, I'm actually going to copy this, Control C, go to the next one, and then we can Control V to paste that in and simply change the color. So let's go for yellow. And then the final one here, we're going to do the same thing. Control V, and then we can change that to green rectangle. And that is it. That is all I needed you to do. Hope you got an okay with that. I will see you in the next exercise.